Hi, Basket Case here. I am going to move on to the Mariposa row, which is wrapping and then adding a bead and wrapping and adding a bead. It looks like two rows, but you do them at the same time. I have finished up row 5 and sewn out. I have some green wax leather thread on my needle. When you wrap, it does use a lot of thread. So you may want to, once you sort of get the hang of it, use a longer piece of thread. I'm going to show you how to add the beads and wrap. We're using size 2 check beads. It's a bead with a larger hole, and that's really the key to adding beads. I always check to make sure my needle and thread will go through the center. There's lots of beads with larger holes. For these purposes, we're using size 2 check beads. When I wrap, you'll notice that this is the beginning of my wrap row. I did not put a bead at the first available stitch. I like to have a little space and I go to the next one. And then you'll notice when I come to finish it, I go past where I started a little bit and I add a bead over what would have been that final stitch so that every stitch has a bead over it. I also like to go a little further than where I'd begun, because otherwise you have this straight line where there's wrap over here and wrap over there. And if you do a lot of them in a row, it creates sort of a visual, your eye just follows it and it kind of interrupts the pattern. So we're going to start our Mariposa row, which is wrapping and adding a bead. We do not sew in and sew out with a wrap row. We wrap over our tail. I'm going to take about the last inch of my tail, my sewing needle sitting over here, and I'm going to lay it on top of the row. I want it pointing toward my guide or pointing out the same direction as my pine needles. I'll press my finger on top of that, or my thumb, just as long as I'm holding it down, and then I'll go between the rows, come up the front, down the back, between the rows, up, down, between. I'm also using this finger to make sure that I'm not going like this to wrap, because then when I squish them back up, it squishes up the tail if it's there, and they're not the right length. I want them to be nice and snug around that row, up, down, between, up, down, between. Once I have this first few rows, I push them over. I always push them together as I'm wrapping every so many wraps, because that gives me a nice solid color and they're very close together. I'm going to wrap over to this stitch. This would have been my first stitch, and that would be too tight because that was my last stitch of that row. So I'm just going to go up, down, between, up, down, between. Once I have a little bit of this going, I'll back off a little to leave more space here to go between the rows. Up, down, between. Now you see there's a little bit of gap between those, so before I go too far, I push those over. And when you do your blow drying as the final step of this, all this wax will meld together and it will get real shiny and it will really bring out the color. Up, down, between, up, down, between, up, down, between. I think of it as laying them next to each other. Give that a good shove. Up, down, between, up, down, between. I'm getting close to where I want to put my bead. If I put the bead on too soon, I'm not quite over the top of that row. I consider this the top of the row, and that's where I want my bead, so it sits between the two rows and it's not being pulled to one side or the other. I put the thread straight down the basket, and then I look between the two rows, and look, it's lined up with the top of that stitch. The way you add a bead in Mariposa, we do bead, stitch, bead. I pick up a bead, I do my stitch, which is back to front, left to right. I'm going through a little bit of the pine needles. And see, I'm holding my thread down as usual so this doesn't unravel. And I've also kind of got the bead wedged in there so it's not coming down the thread and causing the thread to tangle and loop around. Sometimes it loops around the bead and you have to stop and take that all apart. Bead, stitch, and then back up the bead. When I come back up, I have to make sure that I'm going to be wrapping again to the outside. It's easy for this wrap row. See how it's leaning out and it can sort of sway out there and then it changes the shape of your basket. So I hold the row right on top of the one below and I really, really snug this stitch that I've just attached the bead with. The very next wrap that I do, I also hold this all in place the way I want it. I want this row over this one. I don't want it sagging out there. And I give that second wrap another really good snug. I'm going to make sure that my row guide is full. When you're wrapping a row, you're compressing it if you're doing it nice and snug. And if your row guide gets thin, your row looks even thinner because you've compressed it a little bit. And we want a nice even row because that makes our design even. You see, I'm always keeping tension on my thread as usual. I'm going to go up, down, between, up, down, between, up, down, between. And I'm just going to keep on going. When you first do a wrap, they won't all be perfect. Just readjust them as you need to. Once you get a little rhythm going, it's pretty quick. See, if I hold this right there, I'm almost above the top of that stitch. I'm going to do one more. Put my thread straight down the back, and you can see it lines up with the top of that stitch. If your beads aren't over the stitch, it may pull the stitch one direction or the other and misshape that nice spiral that you have going, or it may just have a thread hanging a little awkwardly. Back to front, left to right, bead, stitch, bead. So I have my bead on there. I'm doing my stitch. See this broken one? Just pop that off. And I'm going to go back up the bead, which means I have to sort of tip this out a little bit to make sure I'm still going in the same direction. But remember, push it right back into shape. Hold this where you want it. Give that stitch that you just did, bead, stitch, bead. And now it's seated between the two rows. The rows are both nice and tight. And I'm pulling my bundle to the direction I want so that I don't have a row that's flaying out. And then my second wrap is nice and snug. I am going to show you how to switch threads with a wrap row. I switch in between beads. I don't want to try to be adding a bead and changing thread at the same time. So I'm going to go about halfway between the two beads. I'm keeping that nice and snug. I'll put my bead clip on. I don't like to run my thread right to the end and hope that I make it between the two rows. Once it starts getting short, I'd rather sacrifice a few inches of thread than run out and have to start unwinding things. So I'm going to cut about a 3-inch tail. And then I've got more thread on a needle. And again, I'm going to stick my needle in the pad. Now I have to hold these two tails in the same direction together. Sometimes it's a little awkward, but once you've done it a few times, it works really well. Now I have both tails pointing toward my thread guide or in the same direction as my pine needles. You see I've pinned them down. And then I'm going to wrap right over both tails. And I'm doing nice snug wraps. There's both of those tails. See this little gap? Just push that together. And again, when you get that blow dryer going, those are the little details that you'll go in and adjust to where you want them. I've got this right above that stitch. You can see it in the front. You can see when I go straight down the back, it's right at the top of that stitch. Now I'm going to add another bead. It's bead, stitch, bead. Another thing I want to point out is every so often I just run my finger and thumb down the thread. I don't want to scrape the wax off with my fingernail, but I just want to flatten it out because as you're adding beads and going around, the thread likes to twist up a little. Bead, stitch, bead. I pick up a bead. I'm holding my thread so that it's not coming unwound. I do the same stitch, in on the left, out on the right. And see, I've kind of got the bead propped up in there so that it doesn't go down the thread. Now see, this is trying to go out here, and that will also add to your row flailing. In my mind, this is now a piece of clay, and I'm going to bend it the way I want it. Bead, stitch, bead. I put on my bead, I did my stitch, and I have to bend that out to get up there. I go back up the bead. And then, this is where I get that shaping in. Pull that stitch nice and tight. I'm pulling the bead down toward the row below, and I'm also securing it tight to this row that's above. And then that very next wrap, I snug it down nice and tight, and then I can go on with wrapping. I will trim these because I don't want to keep having to wrap over those tails. It's very secure. And I wanted to get that in there when I introduced the MARIPOSA. I want you to know how to wrap the row, add the beads, and change the threads. I'm going to continue around until I'm almost to the end, and then I'll show you how I finish a wrap row and go up to the next stitch. Okay, see ya.